Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Saad Ul Haque. I'm a research analyst at ISAS, and I will be your host for today's episode on the current state of Afghanistan. A few weeks ago, a series of talks were held in Doha, Qatar, involving the United Nations and the Taliban. Various issues were discussed. However, there was very few outcomes of the talks. Currently, Afghanistan is facing a humanitarian crisis, and over the last few years has been facing political instability and economic regression. To speak on this issue today, we are pleased to have joining us Dr. Shanthie D'Souza, founder and executive director at Mantraya Institute for Strategic Studies and visiting faculty at the Naval War College. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. D'Souza.
Thank you for having me on board. And it's important and interesting that ISAS is discussing Afghanistan, which is a long forgotten conflict. So I'm glad to be here to speak on Afghanistan.
Definitely. Thank you for joining us. So we're nearing the 3-year anniversary of the Taliban's rise to power in Kabul. What I wanted to ask you to kick off the discussion today is could you please highlight how the Taliban's government over the past 3 years has affected the stability in the country?
Well, it's interesting again that you talk about Taliban and the anniversary. It's actually an illegal capture of power by a group which has used terrorism as a method of its legitimacy. So the Taliban, which captured power in Kabul on August 15, 2021, does not have legitimacy both within and outside the country. And having stated that, the problems of governance are galore. The Taliban have not been able to get a good structure of governance because they do follow a very rigid view on governance, which is not in sync with what Afghanistan is today. As you know, Afghanistan in the last 2 decades has transformed itself in ways which has fundamentally changed a lot inside Afghanistan. And I think that is not really understood by many outside Afghanistan because the media and the negative images which kept coming out of Afghanistan demonstrated the fact that Afghanistan remains very primitive and tribal. But what I did see from my field visits and constant work in Afghanistan is the fact that things had changed in that country. And Afghans were able to have their own form of governance, however imperfect the democracy was. So what the Taliban has done today is have a very rigid structure, which the Taliban insurgency at that point of time demonstrated to be a kind of a loose structure. But once they captured power, there was a consolidation of power which occurred, and Amir Habibatullah, who was in Kandahar, controls the moment. So in terms of governance, if you see Afghanistan today, there are a lot of issues in basic structures. If you look at what's happened to the economy, look at the data which has come out from the UNDP and other reports from the country, the Afghan economy has contracted by 27%, and it has led to stagnation in that country. And as you mentioned, the Doha meeting was important because the Taliban were made an effort to go and reach out to the international community through the UN, but they deprived and denied the women's participation in this kind of meeting. And the fact that the regressive policies of the Taliban itself has been counterproductive is indicated by the fact that if you look at the economic picture of Afghanistan, or the economic loss by restriction on women's rights alone is between 600 million to 1 billion US dollar, 1 billion US dollars. So you do see that there has been an economic contraction. There has been a lack of opportunities for Afghans. The unemployment rate has increased substantially to almost 31%. And there are problems in terms of looking at how Taliban are not able to govern the country. I had worked with the Independent Directorate of Local Governance in Afghanistan from 2015 to 2016. And there were certain state structures which were set up and certain amount of work was being done to improve governance and accountability. But today it seems to be that Taliban has supplemented that by its own view. And that has become a problem in terms of service delivery or in terms of looking at how people can generate income. So Afghanistan continues to be dependent on aid, and some of the money is coming in through the UN agencies on humanitarian grounds. But if you look at the social indicators today, what is worrisome is that in terms of the global hunger index, Afghanistan ranks 114 out of 125 countries. And approximately 85% of Afghanistan lives on less than $1 a day. And if you look at the unemployment rate, which I was talking about before, it's around 31% for men, and it's more for women. So there is this concern about what is happening in terms of the economics in the country, which will have implications as more people try to leave. There will be more refugees, and there will be more outward migration occurring from that country, which will put pressure on the Western nations as such. So, on a broad scale, if you look at what's happening in the country in terms of even the political scenario, there's no element of inclusion. So, there is a lot of resistance building up inside that country because there are groups who were legitimately involved in the nation building process in the last 2 decades, and they have been denied the rights. So, it's a picture which is mixed at one level, because this I would like to say with a caveat. I did talk about things which are not working, but some things have been put to place. Like, for instance, the Taliban have been able to improve on the tax systems. They do have border tax being imposed, wherein they do collect certain money from that. Uh, People also talk about the fatigue which had developed in that country, because the 2 decades also saw a lot of violence and unending fighting, that there was fatigue developed among the Afghans. And thereby, they do see an improvement on the security situation. Now, I would say these comes with a caveat, because if you look at the security landscape and the terrorism picture in Afghanistan, the IS presence has increased, and likewise, the Taliban's linkages with Al Qaeda remains intact, and their presence is also increased. So there are things which are seen to be positive with the Taliban capturing power in Afghanistan in terms of bringing down the levels of violence, having certain level of taxation, and also the Taliban had announced a ban on the opium production, which was again seen as one of the positive things. But on the contrary, if you look at the reports which are coming out from UNODC, you see that this has not really made much difference on the ground, because there is a considerable amount of stockpile inside Afghanistan, and that is being shipped out through various routes in the country. For instance, the Haqqani network has been involved in the drug trade, and they have middlemen to promote it. If you look at the governance in terms of the governor of Nangarhar province, who controls the eastern route for narcotic trafficking, and the governor of Balkh province controls the northern route. So while the Taliban have taken steps to eradicate drug production, they have destroyed 834 laboratories and eradicated crops of 14,000 hectares. There is progress, but the progress is only in terms of cultivation, not in terms of the existing stockpiles which are still there. And add to that, there is increase in the synthetic production and trade, especially of meth. So this is a mixed picture in many sense. But on the whole, I think in terms of governance and in terms of political inclusion and participation and rights given to women per se, I think Taliban have taken backward steps, and that itself has been problematic in the country.
Thank you, Dr. D'Souza. I think you raised some really interesting points, especially in regards to the economy. And there's one point I'd like to touch on a bit more, actually, the issue of political legitimacy, and specifically in regards to their treatment of women and minorities. It's been well established. They don't really have a good human track record, but currently and over the last 3 years, have the Taliban implemented any specific policies that have tried to address some of these concerns and critiques? And has there been any really positive developments in regard to women, to the treatment of women and the treatment of minorities?
I think what the Taliban did when they captured power was to depict a moderate picture initially because they were looking for international recognition and funding, and thereby they did show a kind of modicum of moderation in terms of reaching out to the international community, looking to be very amenable of dealing with the international community on women's issues, education, and all of that. But that changed rapidly within less than 3 months of their capture of power. And their policies turned out to be more harsher and more stricter. The Department of Vice and Virtue, which was functioning during Taliban 1.0, was re-established. And all those harsh punishments are being imposed on the people, and there's no respite for these people because they absolutely have lost their freedoms. It's just not about the women in Afghanistan, it's also the men, and also about other groups, the ethnic minorities who have been denied their rights. So that itself is leading to issues. And if you look at reports which are coming out, particularly the UNAMA report, which says that less than 4% of Afghans want recognition for the Taliban. So this gives you a sense of the whole idea of legitimacy of the Taliban, not just from the international community, but also from Afghans who actually do not see this group as one which represents them or one which is capable of governing them. So we do have an issue here, which terrorist groups capture power, and it's illegitimate group, and there's not much the international community is doing about it, including the UN. It is important to engage them because they are there. They are the de facto authorities at the moment, and there seems to be no other option. But beyond that, I think there needs to be a long-term strategy of what really Afghanistan should be in terms of political inclusion and participation of other groups. And I think that should be the key of any kind of engagement of Taliban by the international community.
So I think another aspect to this that I would like if you could expand on, and you mentioned a bit briefly earlier, was the economy, the current economic situation of Afghanistan. I guess people are obviously dissatisfied with the political situation, and the economic situation has also regressed since the Taliban has come to power. I was hoping if you could maybe expand on this a little bit more, and also if you could outline any specific policies that the government has enacted in the last 6 months or 1 year that have tried to address or make things easier for the everyday lives of their citizens.
No, I don't see any kind of policies emerging in which they've tried to address the crisis per se, other than the fact that they're looking for funding. And the fact that they did make an outreach to some of the countries in terms of improving trade and transit. For instance, they did make an outreach to China. As you know, that China is very much interested in including Afghanistan in the Belt and Road Initiative. So they are looking at opportunities on trade and transit. They're also interested in the energy pipelines, that is the trade, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, which would give them good enough revenue. But that is externally. Inside the country, beyond taxation, beyond having small and medium enterprises and investing a little bit in the mining sector from where they are deriving benefits. I don't see them transforming the economy in such a way that it will be a self-sustaining economy. At the moment, it's able to function because it does get certain amount of help from international community, and a certain amount comes from taxation. But beyond that, it's a conflict economy which is generating and sustaining these groups. If you look at the drug trade and the cultivation which has occurred, even despite the eradication, these groups are benefiting from this. So it's just a parallel economy. It's not really a legal economy, and thereby there will be problems in the economic terms for people. And as I mentioned, if you see the high rates of unemployment and you look at people spending less than $1 a day, I mean, that's the kind of money we're talking about. And the deprivation of women itself in terms of denial of their rights, particularly on the employment front, is taking a toll because most of these women are providing for their families, having lost men in the conflict of the last 4 decades. So there is an economic contraction which has occurred, and that is getting difficult. So we don't see the Taliban making policies the way it was, at least in the last 2 decades, however imperfect the policies were, uh, they seem to be generating their own income and sustaining themselves as a group. But for the people, it's become very, very difficult. And thereby it is reaching a situation where, they are high on the global hunger index. And in addition to that, they also face a lot of climate-induced stress and disasters. And that again is taking a toll on them. So there's no clear policy by the Taliban about how they govern and what they want to do on the economic terms. Maybe it's a lack of understanding or a lack of engagement with the international community on this. But having said that, one has to take caution that the leadership, that is the emir, is completely opposed to having any kind of modernization of the state or any kind of outside influence. So if you have to bring about some kind of economic change, it has to be through them, working with them, and gradually building that change, which will take a substantial amount of time.
Thank you. I think you mentioned one quite important point about the hunger index, and obviously the economic situation has led to a major humanitarian crisis that's been going on for a while. Could you possibly please expand on, you already said that the Taliban don't really have a clear-cut policy towards addressing the economic issues. Is this the same in regard to the humanitarian crisis, or are they still reliant on foreign aid and support?
They're very much relying on foreign aid, and if you look at how UN is flushing in money and other countries are following suit, it is the external which is helping Taliban deal with the humanitarian crisis. They themselves do not have much money, or they're not investing much in this issue. So they are externally dependent on aid and assistance, and thereby UN has played an important role on dealing with the humanitarian crisis. But what is more interesting and important is the fact that when UN provides this kind of aid, it needs to set certain levels or certain benchmarks of engagement of what really the Taliban should be adhering to in terms of, the norms of governance or norms of inclusion and norms of participation from the rest of the Afghan society. So that's what is lacking. But the humanitarian crisis itself, I think, uh, has been an issue which the international community has invested in themselves with. Most of the countries are helping Afghanistan in various ways. But that, again, is what happened in the last 2 decades. So you provide humanitarian assistance and keep flushing in money into the country. And there is a situation where you have a conflict which is ongoing, because Afghanistan is not a post-conflict situation. It was not in 2001 till 2021, and neither is it now. It's an ongoing conflict situation, and thereby any kind of economic stabilization programs need to factor in the need and the necessity of including groups which are being excluded. Exclusion by itself leads to a lot of problems in terms of stabilizing the country.
So just to tie all of these different issues in, recently the Taliban delegates from Taliban went to Doha to participate in a United Nations-led talks. Could you possibly highlight what some of the major outcomes of these discussions were, and whether or not the Taliban did show any signs that they would address some of the criticisms that were labeled against the government?
Well, this was the Doha meeting was third meeting where the Taliban participated. The earlier two, they were not included. So they did go with the hope that they would get certain level of legitimacy or recognition by the international community. That itself has been difficult to achieve because the conditions that the Taliban put forward, particularly in terms of denying women's groups any opportunity to take part in the meeting or to be a part of the agenda with the UN itself, created a lot of noise outside the meeting, where women groups were advocating for their participation and were vociferous in their denial of participating in that meeting. So there has been a problem of excluding the women, which became the centerpiece of the Doha process. And thereby, I think the Taliban got away with a lot of things by by the international community just focusing on women's issues, but not looking at what Taliban are doing inside the country in terms of their atrocities, their punishments, and the fact that they're depriving a lot of people their rights. So the Taliban participation in this recent Doha meet can be seen more as a process rather than an outcome of something tangible which they're going to achieve. So it's just maybe starting points of engagement of the international community who really doesn't know how to deal with the Taliban now and what are they looking at in Afghanistan when you try to draw a long or a far-fetched picture of what Afghanistan could be in 10 years from now. I think that's been a difficult scene for the international community. So I think it's interesting that the UN took the step of inviting the Taliban, engaging them. But what has been lacking is a clear roadmap of what the UN visualizes Afghanistan to be, how to make Taliban adhere to certain norms of international governance, follow rules set by the international law, and make sure that the Taliban are able to include and bring about other groups in a way of improving governance at various levels. So we do see, this process as something which is a positive in a way of engagement, but in terms of outcome, I think it has been a huge disappointment. And that's primarily because the UN and the international community do not have a clear roadmap of what and how to deal with the Taliban.
Well, I think you've raised some really important points here, and there seems to be definitely a lot of different avenues that both the international community and the Taliban can go through to kind of rectify the situation right now. We would like to thank you for joining us today for the discussion.
Thank you for having me on board, and I'm glad that your ISAS has taken this initiative to remember and talk about Afghanistan.
Of course, thank you very much. You were listening to South Asia Chat. You can learn more about our work by visiting us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates on our research and publications through social media. You can find us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you.